Hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. Thank you so much for coming back to listen to more of Queen Andraya. Today we are on Chapter 3. Here we go. Chapter 3. Formal Apologies. For the very first time, Andraya sat on the solid gold throne reserved for the head crown. She smoothed her purple silk gown with yellow florals trimming the skirt and swirling up and around the bodice. Her feathered hairpiece ornamented with yellow jewels fanned out behind her, circling around her head like a peacock's opened tail. She watched with scrupulous eyes as noblemen promenaded through the double doors of the long assembly hall. Each one separated themselves by higher and lower ranks on either side of the red carpet that stretched the length of the marble floor and up the step of the dais to Andraya's throne. What a refreshing change it was for Andraya to sit up here alone, rather than on the throne next to King Gordon, which she had only been allowed to do on evenings of entertainment, and the rare occasions where commoners were allowed to tour the palace. The 4 men required to apologize stepped onto the red carpet, waiting to be called forward as the tradition held. "Good afternoon," Andraya said in a loud voice. All of the audience bowed toward her. In that moment, Andraya realized that once again she was the only woman in the room. She moaned internally. This formal apology assembly is to allow these 4 gentlemen the opportunity to mend their behavior during the Royal Island Coalition meeting this morning. I would like to begin with the Grand Duke of Gulen. The stocky middle-aged gentleman stepped forward and bowed his russet head. He spoke in a stagnate tone. "I apologize, Your Majesty, for disrupting the coalition meeting. My only goal was to defend my position against those accusing me. I meant no offense to Her Majesty the Queen." Despite the Duke's lack of feeling in his speech, Andraya believed his words. Next, the ambassador of Sandrian stepped forward with a bow and spoke in a quite peculiar accent. "I too apologize, Your Majesty. I have trouble getting along with the Grand Duke of Gulen." The lanky man shifted his eyes sideways to glare at the Duke. "I should have saved our previous conflicts for another time." Andraya sucked in a breath, surprised by his honesty. The 3rd nobleman mumbled relatively the same thing as the previous ambassador. "Thank you for your apologies, gentlemen. You 3 are forgiven and may join the others. Now, Prince Stefan, you are an entirely different matter altogether." Prince Stefan stepped forward and bowed deeply. Andraya could have sworn she saw Chancellor Dolian on the sidelines smirk in his direction. "I, too, apologize, Your Majesty," the prince said, his words stiff and careful. "Mr. Besnick," the Queen called, scanning the room for the royal treasurer. "Here I am, Your Majesty." The plump older man stepped forward out of the left line and bowed. "Please come forward." Besnick obeyed as everyone else in the room watched him with curious eyes. He stood next to but slightly behind the prince. "Prince Stefan, my royal treasurer here speaks Deldrian, and I have asked him to translate for you today." Besnick spoke something foreign in a low voice, to which the prince turned his head and nodded slightly. Surprised mutterings sprinkled the room. "Your Majesty, may I inquire to the meaning of this?" Andraya led her eyes to an older gentleman who stood at the front on her right, which position held the highest rank in the room, next to the head crown. "Marquis Draven Dunbar, why do you interrupt me?" The Marquis squared his shoulders and lifted his chin. His jet-black hair slicked back tightly against his head with a perfect glue. His well-fit frame suggested strength and good health, but his wrinkled forehead and cheeks gave his older years away. Andraya noticed that this was the very first time he had spoken to her in the entire year she had lived in Chaldrea. His tone colored with derision when he spoke. "I beg your pardon, Your Majesty, but I must insist to inquire the reason you believe our treasurer can speak this foreign tongue that is unknown to the rest of us. And why should we trust this tortoise of a man who is not a member of the nobility?" Besnick's face soured, but he held his perfect posture with pure confidence. Andraya raised an eyebrow. "Insults at a formal apology assembly? I believe this makes you next in line, Your Grace." The Marquis's chest heaved with irritation as he glared at the Queen with loathing. He shifted his eyes toward the treasurer. "I beg your pardon, Besnik," Draven said with a slight growl. Andraya knew it was the best she was going to get from him. Besnik nodded curtly in his direction and held his chin high as he kept his eyes on the Queen. "Now, to your point, Your Grace, why should I not believe Besnik speaks the truth?" Andraya asked. Draven threw the Queen a condescending smile, then spoke in a low, menacing tone. "I know your daddy trusted him, but you do not need to follow in the footsteps of the King of Medine." He spit out the words like her father's name was something to despise, which only fueled her animosity toward the Marquis. She suspected he wanted to see her burst into tears, or throw out a childish scream of sorts. Her chest seized with anger, but Andraya would not give him the satisfaction. "Perhaps, Your Grace, you should concern yourself with your own trustworthiness." Marquis Draven's lips split into a sardonic grin. Perhaps Her Majesty could learn from those with experience. Andraya returned the wicked smile. "I intend to, especially from you." She knew Draven grasped her irony, but he seemed to enjoy it as his smirk deepened. Andraya turned her attention back to Besnik and the prince. "Where is your previous translator, Prince Stefan?" "He dismiss, my queen." The prince attempted to respond. Besnik and the prince spoke in low voices before Besnik announced, "His Highness dismissed him, Your Majesty, as he suspected foul play." "Oh, how so?" Stefan murmured to Besnik again, while Besnik faced the Queen with a perfect stance and stoic face as he translated for the prince. "He knew the translator had misspoken by your reaction to his words, which were only against Gulin's sin of slavery." A few scoffs and grunts burst the otherwise silent response. Andraya ignored them. "Prince Stefan, are you aware of what your translator did say?" The prince shook his head. "I am not, my queen." "Do tell him, Besnik," Andraya said. Prince Stefan slowly looked more and more alarmed as Besnik related the scene from earlier in Deldrian. He glanced back and forth between Andraya and Besnik in obvious chagrin. The prince moved closer to the Queen and got down on both knees. Even though Andraya did not understand his words, she knew they were elegant and articulate. And his face was so handsome, she was glad she was expected to stare at him during his proclamations. "My dear Queen of Chaldrea, please allow me to apologize for these offenses," Besnik translated for him. "I take complete responsibility in my neglect to fully inspect the character of the man who traveled with me as my translator. His deceit is unpardonable, his words unspeakable and vile to the utmost degree, and you, my queen, deserve nothing less than the most honorable of speeches." Besnik cleared his throat before he continued. "You deserve nothing less than speech that reflects your own grace and beauty, your own intelligence and wisdom and capability, not only in your royal head, but in your pure and divine calling of womanhood." Andraya's eyes bulged and her head jolted back, as she had never heard anything like this in her entire life. She barely heard the soft groans scattering the room. "The prince would like to know if Her Majesty is pleased with his apology, and if there is anything else at all that he may grant you." "Oh yes, I am very pleased," Andraya said, not able to peel the smile off her face. She was uncertain if this excessive praise from the prince was sincere or just a desperate act to keep himself in the coalition. Either way, Andraya thoroughly enjoyed it. "And I do have a request." The prince bowed his head. "Anything you wish, Your Majesty," Besnik translated for him. "I would like you to allow Besnik to tutor you in Chaldrayan until you master the language." The prince bowed his head again. "It would be my great pleasure, Your Majesty." "I am happy to hear it." "You may stand, Your Highness," Andraya said, resisting the urge to add, "Goodness me." The prince stood, placed his hands behind his back, and met Andraya's gaze. His bright blue eyes were so distinct and so different than all the dark eyes she was accustomed to. She found she wanted to stare at them longer. But she was the queen and would stay focused. "The business for this assembly is finished. Thank you all for coming." Andraya stood from her throne and walked down the steps, allowing her long purple train to follow behind. Besnik and the prince stepped aside to allow her to pass on the red carpet. Both lines on either side bowed as she walked down the hall with perfect posture, a high head, and marked steps. And for the very first time ever, Andraya felt like a queen. And that concludes Chapter 3. I hope you come back next Thursday to hear Chapter 4, which is called Bad News, Bad Letters, Bad Roses. And it is also quite probable that I will give you 2 chapters next week, since Chapter 4 is quite short. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.